So it
Okay.
gives me a great pleasure to welcome Caroline Curvan to join the BNRA on this interesting talk. I sailed with Caroline across the Pacific, and we have several other Europa crew with us today. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Caroline. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if
So,
everybody can mute their microphones, please.
yes, thank you. And can you all see the slides okay? They're not obscured by the faces or anything? Yeah, I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. Well, thank you, James, for this opportunity. I've been giving this presentation around the area here a bit, and it's been pretty successful. But I just wanted to point out that this picture that we see is our lovely Bark Europa at sunset in Savu Savu Bay in Fiji. So we're going to be time traveling from Ossining, New York in 2024 back to the South Pacific in 1838. We're going to be following the illustrator Alfred Agate, who was the one of two illustrators on the United States exploring expedition of 1838 to 1842. So let's go. So some of you might not be aware of what Ossining is. Hold on, sorry, there we go. So if you've heard of Ossining, or if you haven't heard of Ossining, perhaps you've heard of Sing Sing Prison. It's an iconic prison that is about 30 miles north of Manhattan, right along the Hudson River. It was built in 1825 when our Alfred Agate was also living nearby, and it is still standing today and is a Supermax facility where I actually teach. And I was supposed to teach there today, but they've canceled all classes because it is election day here. So anyway, Alfred Agate. This is the person that I am obsessed with. This is a portrait of him that was painted in 1838 by his brother Frederick. And Alfred was one of two artists on the U.S. exploring expedition. I discovered his story while researching something completely else. I am the town historian of Ossining, and I was putting together a presentation on something else and stumbled upon his story. I learned about his artistic career, and then I learned about his part in the United States exploring expedition, which I had never heard of. And so I fell down this rabbit hole to a point where I signed on to spend 5 weeks as a trainee sailor / voyage crew on the Bark Europa, sailing from Tahiti to Tonga and Fiji. Now, I say that the ship that we were on, the Bark Europa, was a 19th century sailing ship. That's not actually quite accurate. She was built in 1915 and spent the first, 60 years of her career as a light ship at the mouth of the Elbe, and then she was purchased and then turned into a tall ship who did races, and now she also brings passengers mostly down to Antarctica, but she did this South Pacific tour this summer. So Alfred Agate, he was born in Ossining, which was the part of Ossining that was then called Sparta, in 1814. And he was one of three artists in his family. His older brother, Frederick, was a very talented artist and started studying art in New York City when he was about 15. By the time he was 20, he had helped found the National Academy of Design, which was one of the very first American schools of art. Not the first school of art in America, but it was the first school that was trying to create a really American form of art. And it still exists today, although it's more of an honorary society. But Frederick was Alfred and his sister Harriet's first teachers. He taught them sketching and oil painting, and then they went into the city and they both studied at the National Academy of Design, and they exhibited paintings at the annual exhibition of the National Academy of Design. So all three of the Agates were quite talented artists. By the time our Alfred, he's so cute. I mean, look at him. I just have such a crush on him. I think that might be why I actually went down to the South Pacific to follow in his wake. But by the time he was 20, he had opened up his own studio in Lower Manhattan, and he had put out his shingle and was doing miniatures and portraits, and he was quite successful. He left behind a huge trove of all sorts of different art, a lot of it obviously from the United States exploring expedition, but he also has, there's a lot of his work extant. We know that they lived in this house. They grew up here at the Agate house and that is still standing. And I actually just got a tour of it because it's on the market, but my husband is not interested in spending $2 million on a 12-bedroom house. So I think I shall not be owning it. In 1837, our Alfred is doing quite well, but he signs on to be one of two illustrators on what was then called the U.S. South Seas Expedition. Um, here's an example of some of the work he was doing before he signed on to do the U.S. exploring expedition. When he accepted this position, he was going to be paid what I think was about $2,000 US at the time, which I have worked out to be about 52,000 pounds today, which is actually a pretty good salary, I'd say. Even now, I wonder how much our the crew on the Bark Europa was getting paid, but he was getting $2,000 plus his rations per year. And his title was portrait and botanical artist, and he was mostly used to do portraits and landscapes because that was his métier, if you will. So the U.S. exploring expedition, how many of you have actually heard of this? Has anybody here heard of it? No? You know, it's funny. I actually gave this talk to a bunch of New York State historians, and none of them had heard of it, which is a little shocking because there were actually a lot of New Yorkers involved in it. But yeah, it's one of these. It's the largest expedition, U.S. expedition, I think, that you've never heard of. And I'd love to go into all sorts of detail on how it came to be, but we just don't have that kind of time. I will just say it went by several different names. The U.S. South Seas Expedition, sometimes it was called the Charles Wilkes Expedition after the commander of it. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just call it the USXX because otherwise it's quite a mouthful. If you're interested in learning more about the background of it, I have to recommend this book by Nathaniel Philbrick, Sea of Glory. He wrote it in 2003, and it gives you a great it gives you the backstory of how it all came to be and what it meant and sort of what its legacy was, because it actually there is quite a legacy to this exploring expedition, but nobody really seems to know much about it. I will just say that this expedition took about 12 years to come into being. It started with our 6th president, John Quincy Adams, who decided he wanted to send a government ship down to the Pacific, primarily for exploration purposes to benefit the whaling and sealing industries, who were plying their trade in the southern waters at that point. And they needed updated charts and maps, and they also needed treaties to get negotiated with local chiefs so that they could, they could trade with them. And also there was a little bit of a sense that we no longer wanted to rely on British charts because we were an independent country. So we wanted to go down to and make our own charts and show that we could do things on our own. The U.S. exploring expedition was very important in terms of literature in the United States too. In the 19th century, one of the more famous books that comes out of it is actually Herman Melville's Moby Dick. You might have heard of that. It is believed that he not only used, we know that he had a copy of the 5-volume narrative of the U.S. exploring expedition, but we also think he might have based his character of Captain Ahab on this man, who was Charles Wilkes, who was the commander of the United States exploring expedition. He was nicknamed the Stormy Petrel, and he was known to be a very talented navigator and surveyor, but a really terrible leader. And so he was actually court-martialed for several things when he came back. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. His crew called him the Stormy Petrel because he was known to just kind of lose his cool all the time and storm about. And he was known for inflicting excessive punishment on his men and exacting revenge for various things. So he was not a particularly respected leader, unfortunately. One of his biographers calls him conceited, domineering, and arrogant. And another one says he was an enormously capable, prolific, and pompous prick. So he does not have a very good legacy in history, although he is memorialized probably as Captain Ahab. But he was a very, very talented man in terms of navigation and surveying, which was important. And he was probably just about the second to last person the Navy wanted to put in charge of this expedition. But because this expedition took so long to get off the ground, to get to sea, nobody worth their salt wanted to be in charge of it. So he wanted it and he got it. And for better or for worse, he was probably one of the best people who could have done it, as well as one of the worst. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. I'm going to show you a super wordy slide next, which is going to show you just sort of how unwieldy and multi-pronged the mission of the USXX had become in the 12 years it took to get it out to sea. They had all these ideas that it was going to put America on the international stage and that we were going to participate in the world of science and discovery and catch up to the British and to the French and to the Dutch. We were going to improve navigation by updating maps and charts, and also find more weather and current data, negotiate treaties, measure the force of gravity in various spots of the Earth. Why not? Sounds good. We were going to discover Antarctica and investigate exotic habitats, study languages and customs. It was a whole bunch of things. So it's kind of amazing that really anything got done at all. But the idea was that it was not for conquest, but for discovery, which is all very highfalutin language. But there was really not much we could have conquered at that point because most of the South Pacific had already been conquered and colonized. So we were just going there just for commerce, not for colonies. One of the things that does come out of it, though, is that the Charles Wilkes is said to have been the one to discover the Antarctic continent. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not that's true, but he believed it was true and had this chiseled on the back of his tombstone at Arlington Cemetery. He discovered the Antarctic continent, January 19th, 1840. So it must be true if that happened. All right, so here's a map of all the different places the USXX went. I hope you can see it. They traveled over 87,000 nautical miles over 4 years, and it's really just sort of a very confusing pretzel of where they went. But the part that I'm really concerned with is this tiny little part here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean from Tahiti to Tonga to Fiji, because that's what we traveled with the U.S. With the Bark Europa. The whole expedition at the time cost over $300,000, which is probably about 8 million pounds in today's money. There were about 500 men who served, about 100 officers, and 400 sailors and other crew. Out of that number of 500, 9 of them were scientifics and or illustrators. They had 7 scientists, geologists, mineralogists, naturalists, botanists, a couple of linguists, and then there was also the 2 illustrators, one of whom, of course, was our dear Alfred Agate. But I think that ratio really tells you what they were really about, that out of 500, 9 of them were actually involved in science and exploration. It was really more for the commercial part of it. So here we have a picture of all of the 6 ships that were sent out in August of 1838. 4 of these pictures were done by Alfred Agate. This one here of the USS Vincennes was actually painted by Charles Wilkes, the commander, and I'm actually not sure who did this one of the porpoise, but let's just say it was the internet. So out of these 6 ships that left, only 2 of them returned. The first one here, which is the USS Relief, which was the first ship our Alfred Agate was on, was a store ship, and it was very unwieldy and very slow. And so by the time they hit Callao, the port just near Lima, Charles Wilkes had decided the ship was useless and he wanted to get rid of some people anyway. So he sent the captain and some of the people he didn't want on the expedition back home to the States. So then our Alfred Agate's transferred to this ship, which is the USS Peacock, which was one of the 2 sloops of war. That ship was wrecked at the mouth of the Columbia River in 1841, and Alfred Agate and all the rest just barely escaped with their lives. Alfred apparently lost a lot of his illustrations when he was scrambling to get off the sinking ship. And then he was transferred to the USS Vincennes, which was the flagship of the expedition and was the ship that Charles Wilkes was in charge of. So he probably was one of the very few people who was still on speaking terms with Charles Wilkes at the end of this expedition. So I wanted to compare the USS Vincennes to the ship that we were on, the Bark Europa. The Vincennes, it was a sloop of war, about 43 meters long, about 11 meters wide. There were about 190 souls aboard. They had 18 guns, and their top speed was 18 knots. Our ship, the beautiful Bark Europa, she was a 3-masted steel bark. She's about 60 meters long, 9 meters the beam. We had 44 souls aboard. Our top speed is apparently 13 knots. I think maybe we could get a little faster, but we also had no guns and no weapons aboard. Before I left, I had downloaded every single picture I could think of that Alfred Agate had drawn, because I had this little sort of performance art fantasy that I would get someplace and I would see the same viewpoint that he had seen, and I would be able to travel through time and stand next to dear Alfred Agate and be on the USXX myself. I did think that was a little crazy, I'm not going to lie, but this was sort of my plan. So I'm going to show you a few pictures of shipboard life on the Bark Europa. Some of you might enjoy seeing some of these pictures. Here's the first one we have. The one in the middle, that is me at the helm. I am actually steering the ship. Took me quite a while to get it all decent at it. James can attest to that. There was on more than one occasion I would be steering the ship, and either Captain Hans or First Mate Terry would come out of the bridge and say, "What exactly are you trying to steer?" So, but I finally figured out how to do that. And on either side, we have 2 of our crew members who are sewing up a sail that needed mending. And this sort of leads into one of the next pictures, that one of the first Alfred Agate pictures I was able to connect to, which was this one of a sailor just sitting, just the two we had. This here made me think of that picture, and so I thought, I'm already starting along Alfred Agate's trail here. Here we have another couple of pictures. On the right, we have our bosun Brian talking to Vi, who was one of our crew members. She was actually from Tonga, so I'll be talking a little bit more about her later. They're just standing at the rail talking, and on the left, we have a sketch that Alfred Agate did of 2 sailors just standing at the rail talking. So some things don't change too much. Here we have a classic picture. This is, we can see Andrew there in the middle. He is helping furl a sail. This was something I personally was never able to do, because I had read too many stories of sailors, I guess, falling to their death from the yardarms, even though we all were wearing harnesses. But this is something that this is happening now, and it could have happened 185 years ago. Some things just don't change. You have to furl and unfurl your sails, and you have to climb up and do it by hand. Here's a picture of me that James took. This is as high as I ever got. I might be smiling, but I'm actually screaming inside, and I never got any farther up the mast than this. Here we have a couple pictures of our captain and our first mate, Terry. Captain Hans and Terry were they were great fun, and they really were very open about what was happening. I don't know if you can see, but Terry is not only wearing a rain jacket, but he also has his harness on top of that rain jacket. We were trying to enter Benga Lagoon that was just out. It was just south of one of the main islands of Fiji, and the charts we had, the British Admiralty charts, I will have you know, were very poor. And apparently we were looking for a conspicuous mango tree to sight off of, so we knew we were taking the right route into this treacherous lagoon. But Terry didn't think that was good enough, and so he climbed to the very tippy top of the foremast and was standing atop the yardarm of the skysail, and he had a radio and was, even though we had all modern navigational equipment, sometimes you still need a human being to take a look with human eyes and tell you what they're seeing. I actually knew that the USXX, I had a copy of their chart of Bengal Lagoon, and I tried to offer it to Captain Hans, and he just sort of sniffed at me and said, "We are not using a 184-year-old chart. We will use the British Admiralty charts." So that's what we did. Here's also a picture, just a little Alfred Agate picture of his first captain, Andrew Long, who got sent back on the USS Relief, but just had to compare that to our picture of Captain Hans in his Finnish Army uh, uh, coat there. Other things people want to know about is what the living conditions were like on the tall ship, and was I sleeping in hammocks? And no, I did not sleep in a hammock. This was actually my cabin. It only slept 4 people, which was nice, and there were only 3 of us in it, which was even better. So we had an extra bunk to store all our luggage. It was lovely, but we didn't spend much time in there because there was really not much space to do anything but sleep and change your clothes. We also did have our own ensuite bathroom and hot and cold running water. We had air conditioning. We had all modern conveniences, which of course they would not have had on the USS Vincennes or on any of the other ships of the USXX. However, I do have a letter that one of the past midshipmen wrote to his sister, describing his cabin. This was past midshipman William Reynolds, and he was only sharing his cabin with another past midshipman, and he describes in a letter to his sister about the silver plate candlesticks and the handsome mirrors and the damask bed covers and the Brussels carpets and the white and red draperies and the Bowie knives, pistols, and cutlasses that are displayed in different places and give the man of war finish to the whole. So their cabin sounds a little bit nicer than ours. And then he went on to describe how it became sort of the lounge for all the young officers aboard the USS Vincennes, which again leads me to believe they had slightly nicer accommodations than we did, because there was no doing anything in our cabin except changing clothes in the dark and going to sleep. A couple of other fun things we had aboard the Bark Europa was we had live music. Our captain was a good violinist. We had Andrew, who was a good guitarist, and we had Amelie, who not only was a good drummer, but she also taught us how to sing sea shanties. And sometimes we would even try to sing these sea shanties as we were pulling lines. And there you can see me pulling line, and there you can see James. I think we are setting one of the flying jib or something like that. And a couple of times we did try to sing these sea shanties so that we would all pull at the same time, but we were not too successful at that. They did give us this little cheat sheet, which I dutifully carried around with me for the entire 5 weeks. I always had it in my pocket. I was constantly trying to memorize all the lines and the pins. I think by the end of 5 weeks, I was pretty good with most of the sails, but right to the end, they would say, you know, we need to set this sail and go find the bunt line for this sail. And I would more or less know where it was on the pin rail. So I would go to the general area and just hope someone got there before me and took the coil of rope off the pin, because you don't want to be pulling on the wrong rope. So now for the actual visiting of the islands. The first place we went was Tahiti, also known as I'm sure you all know, as the Society Islands, so called, I believe, by Captain James Cook, because there are a couple stories about that. I like the story that he named it after the Royal Society, who had bankrolled his first expedition down there. The USXX was there for about 2 weeks from September 15th through October 1st, 1839. I was there from June 21st through July 9th. I had done a little bit of tiki touring before I got on board the ship. Here we have a map that comes from the USXX. This is of the main island of Tahiti Nui, and the smaller island of Tahiti Iti. It's actually not an island because they are actually connected. If any of you watched the Olympics, the Teahupu surfing, it all happened right around here. And we did have the opportunity to go visit the Olympic Village before the Olympics, and they were still kind of desperately trying to finish it 10 days before they were supposed to have the Olympics there. So I guess they finished it. So one of the first time traveling things I got to have when I landed in Tahiti was this picture. And it absolutely was thrilling to me that this is a picture of Moorea, the island of Moorea, as seen from Papeete, Tahiti. And here we have a picture on the left that Alfred Agate drew in 1839 of Moorea, which was then called Aimeo, and they look almost exactly the same. He was obviously very accurate landscape artist. So that was pretty thrilling to me. I knew that we were both you had to be on the water to get this view. So I knew that the two of us had been on a ship on the same little patch of water, looking at the exact same thing at the same time of day, practically, and you almost see the same clouds above Moorea, which was pretty thrilling to me. Other things that I found from Tahiti that just kind of interested me. This was a portrait that Alfred Agate did of Paufai, who was the advisor to Queen Pomare IV. When the USXX was down in Tahiti, the French were also down there trying to get Queen Pomare to, let them take care of everything for her. And by 1841, the French had colonized Tahiti. So the USXX was just there to just sort of do a little bit of surveying and head on. Here's another picture that Alfred Agate did. This is also in the narrative. This is just a Tahitian girl wearing a Tahitian headdress. I just enjoyed that picture. Then the last picture I have of Tahiti is another one of those being on the water and seeing a view. This one on the left is actually a picture that James took for me, because he had the better camera. This was of Opanohu Bay, but Alfred Agate had also done the same picture, but it was called Talu Bay back in the day. So, but again, we had to be in pretty much the same place to get this this image, and some things don't change. So that was sort of fun for me again. So from here, we went to Tonga. We sailed for 10 days. We went by way of Raiatea and Taha and Bora Bora. And then we sailed for 10 days to Tonga. The USXX did not go straight to Tonga. They went basically to Australia. Then some of them went down to Antarctica, and then they went up to New Zealand, and then they rendezvoused in Tonga. Tonga was not considered a very important place for them, so they were just using it as a place for them to rendezvous. So I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures from our 10 days at sea. We had the most magnificent weather. It was really a flat calm. I didn't think so at the time, but now I look back on it, we were maybe going 5-6 knots, and there were a couple of days we did have to turn on our engines because we were just going too slow. And there was one day we just stopped, and the captain let us all jump off and swim in the 5,000 meter South Pacific Ocean there. But this was just water, water everywhere, and people ask me if I found this scary at all, but it really wasn't, because we were all together on this boat. We were isolated in our floating home, as somebody once said. And I found it absolutely restful and wonderful, partially because we had no cell service, because we couldn't look anything up. So you had no idea what was going on in the world. And boy, was that fantastic. Here we have a couple of other pictures. Both of these are taken on the same watch, um, from the helm, actually. This first one on the left is of moonlight on the. We had a full moon, and it was moonlight on the South Pacific, taken from the helm, just looking towards the bow, and it was just bright as day. And when we didn't have a moon, we had so many stars you can't even imagine it. It was fantastic. And then the picture on the right is of a sunrise, also taken from the helm, just looking behind, towards this over the stern. And it was just magical to be able to watch the sunrise and the sunset and the moonrise and all the stars. And you realize how out of touch we are with the simple things of nature like that. Um, so the next place we landed was in the Kingdom of Tonga, and that's sometimes called the Friendly Islands. I think that is also something that was named by Captain Cook. As I said, the USXX didn't seem very interested in Tonga. They didn't seem to do much in the way of surveying. I can't even find a map that they drew of Tonga. We were in Tonga for 3 days. So because I can't find a map that they drew, I'm sort of reduced to using this 1900s map that I found on at an from out of an Encyclopedia Britannica, because I just wanted to show you that we were in the Vavau group, which was the most northernmost group of Tonga. Tonga consists of about 169 islands, of which maybe today 35 are inhabited, probably more or less the same back in the 1840s. I do have to point out here, though, we have the volcano of Tofoa, or Tofua, which was where Captain Bligh and his loyalists was one of the first pieces of first land that they were able to stop at after they had been mutinied and put on board a launch. The mutiny happened somewhere in the Hapai group, about 30 miles to the east, I believe, of Tofua. Um, and they landed on Tofua, and here's where Captain Bligh, he wrote up his report of the mutiny, and then he wrote a letter to his wife, and he ordered his men to get as much food and water and whatever they could to and see what they had in the boat, because of course the mutineers had really thrown them on this boat with very little. They had like a pocket watch, a sextant, and a compass. They didn't even have any charts. And we were really hoping that we could get down to Tofua and at least take a look at this island, but it is still an active volcano. And the Captain Hans had no interest in trying to get down through the islands of Tonga, so we didn't get to do that. So one thing that was absolutely fantastic to me was we had the great honor of being of having an umu, or a feast, given in our honor. And one of the things that I knew from reading all 5 volumes of the narrative, or at least skimming them, was that the USXX and Charles Wilkes and his officers were often going to feasts. Pretty much every island they went to, there was a feast. And what I found fascinating was how similar the feasts were, not only all throughout Polynesia, but how similar the feasts were that they experienced in Polynesia in 184 years ago, compared to the feast that we experienced in Tonga. So what I'm going to do is show you a few pictures of the feast that we attended, but I'm going to caption it with words from the narrative. So here we have a picture of the umu, or the underground oven. In most of Polynesia, the word for feast and the word for underground oven tend to be the same. In Hawaii and in New Zealand, those are the same words. And in Tonga, it's umu for the feast and umu for the oven. And this is where you really had this fantastic layering of time and time travel. At least in my head, I did. So This was the umu, and here is what the narrative says about it. The feast takes many hours to prepare and is generally directed by the women, with the men performing the labor. Check. First, the cooking place is excavated a foot deep and about 8 feet square. Check. The meat is placed upon hot stones, after which taro, yams, and coconuts are placed. Finally, it is all covered with banana leaves and earth. So check on the left, you see the oven as it's been all covered up, and on the right, you see the men taking all the items out of the oven so that we can eat them. Here we have a picture of the table that we were all sitting at with all the food laid out for us. Um, the narrative notes that at these feasts there is an abundance of fish. They likewise have fine crabs and are also generous with fowls and pigs. And the feasts are attended with much ceremony and form. So that was what we experienced. As I mentioned, Vi was one of our crew members, and it was her family that was hosting us at this beautiful feast. And so she took us around, she showed us everything. And then right before we ate, there was some chanting and some prayers that were given by her uncle. And then they were just like, go ahead and eat. And I don't know if it was just an American thing or if it's a European thing, but I know I felt really awkward that we were sitting there eating and our hosts were just standing around watching. And I said something to Vi, and she said, no, we've invited you to feast. So you feast first. It would be rude if we sat down next to you and we competed with you for the food. So it's very different than the way I always think of, is you invite people over and you break bread together. That's not how it works in Polynesia. So that was just an interesting little cultural difference. If anybody here is a vegetarian, trigger warning, you might not like this next picture, but here we have our one of our many, I think we had 4 piglets on the table. The narrative notes that the first course consists of fish, some steamed in banana leaf and some served in banana trunks. These things are the banana trunks, and somewhere back here are some fish that are steamed in coconut milk and wrapped in banana leaf. The second course is taro, yams, and kumara with fruit and bananas offered as well. Here we have our chunks of taro, and we have our bananas, and back here we have some yams and kumara, which are 2 different types of yams that are native to Polynesia. And the third and principal course consists of meat. Whole piglets are served and then disjointed. And here we have our whole piglet. And one of Vi's cousins, I think, came to the table with a large machete and disjointed it right in front of us, and then picked up a big chunk of pig and handed it to us to eat. So we ate it because wanted to be polite. The next thing is after the third course, dancing, music, stories, and kava drinking succeed. And here we have some dancing done by Vi's cousins. And here we have some musicians with their kava bowl. Kava is actually one of the few, I believe, native intoxicants that is used in Polynesia. It's actually a root, the Piper mysticum, and the way it used to be made, the young girls of the clans would chew these roots and they would spit out whatever, they would spit it out into the bowl, and when there was enough kava spit, they would then pour water onto it, mix it up, and then they would serve it. When Charles Wilkes saw this, he absolutely categorically refused to drink any of this, which was considered incredibly rude. And I have to give a shout out here to Captain Cook, who would pretty much eat or drink just about anything that was put in front of him. We did all get to taste the kava, which it kind of tastes the way it looks, kind of like muddy water, like a mud puddle. I personally didn't find it to be particularly intoxicating, but maybe you need to drink a whole lot of it. These musicians kept filling up the bowls and they kept drinking it. And by the end of the night, there was at least one musician who had just kind of laid down next to his instrument. And I don't know if he stayed there all night, but he seemed to have had the effects of kava. The other thing we got to do in our 3 days in um, Tonga was to swim with whales. And here we have a picture that was taken by Andrew Wilshire, who was on this call, of a humpback whale breaching. We were on this little boat and we were all dressed up in wetsuits, and we had our snorkel gear on, and we were ready to jump in the water so we could actually swim with these giant whales. And we just happened to catch this whale breaching right in front of our boat. We also have these two pictures that were taken by James on his GoPro. We had jumped in, and it was a mama and a baby humpback, and they just swam. They were completely chill with us. We were just about 10, 15 feet above them, and they just were swimming down below us. The baby kept going up and down and around, and we just were holding our breath and just absolutely amazed that we were so close to these giant mammals in the water. Um, After Tonga, we headed to Fiji. This was going to be the last stop of our voyage. This was obviously not the last stop of the voyage of the USXX, although they did spend several months there because this was a very important a port for them. They really wanted to, Fiji at this time, which was, I did not write this out, but they were known as the Cannibal Islands. They were considered, they were very, they did not enjoy people landing on their islands. And so Captain Cook mostly avoided it. We know that Captain Bligh avoided it as well, and in fact had to tack and had to sail and tack very, very carefully to get away from the natives who were pursuing him through what is still called Bligh Water. But Fiji was one of the last islands really to be colonized, or to sort of to work with the if you will, the Europeans in any way. So for the USXX, this was going to be a very profitable place. They wanted to get good charts, and they also wanted to have they wanted to set up treaties with the various chiefs. I will say, though, Fiji was one of the places that the USXX had some of their most violent encounters with natives. So here we actually have a chart of Fiji, the two main islands, Vanuatu up to the north here, and then Vitulevu to the south here. We actually came in from the north, and we came to Savu Savu Bay, and we stayed here, and then we kind of went down to the south of Vitulevu. Here we have Benga, and we actually have a chart of that, which Captain Hans didn't want to use. And then we went around the west of Vitulevu, and we docked in Lautoka. So one of the first sites I saw was another Alfred Agate sketch, which made me so happy. Here we have on the right, we have a picture I took of Savu Savu Bay at sunset in 2024. And on the right, we have a sketch that he made in 1841. So I sort of felt like I was definitely in his footsteps yet again. So as I said, this was one of the most violent, one of the places where they had some of the most violent encounters. And it happened because of this gentleman, Chief Vedovi. And he was a chief of one of the main villages in Vitulevu, Fiji. And this is where we see Charles Wilkes just making some incredibly poor choices. He was always trying to impress his superiors, even though there were no superiors around, but he was always trying to do things that he thought they would want him to do, and that would make him look good. So he had heard through the grapevine that Chief Vedovi had murdered several crew members of a Nantucket whaler called Charles Daggett in about 1836. So he thought that what they needed to do was they needed to punish Vedovi for doing this. So the first thing he did was he invited Vedovi on his ship, and he said, "Is this true? Did you kill these sailors?" And Vedovi said, "Yes, absolutely. They landed on my beach. That's fair game. We took their boat and we killed them and we ate them." And so long story short, Charles Wilkes then decides what he's going to do is kidnap Vedovi, take him back to the States, put him on trial, have him punished, and then bring him back to Fiji, where he would then, no doubt, tell everybody, don't mess around with the white men because look what they did to me. So he does this. He kidnaps Vedovi. And here's a picture of Vedovi after they've kidnapped him. They have shaved off his beard, they've cut most of his hair, and they have kept him in chains until they actually leave Fiji. I don't really know what Charles Wilkes was thinking because he still had quite a bit of surveying to do. So so he's got Vedovi on his boat, and he's got his ships, his other ships out surveying. Here we are at Malolo Island, and this is where two of his where some of his officers were doing some surveying work. Two of them end up getting killed, and it's a very awful situation. Here we actually have a very bad picture, not by Alfred Agate. This is actually by another lieutenant who was on this expedition, of Lieutenant Joseph Underwood and Midshipman Henry getting killed by a Fijian native. And here we actually have a miniature of Lieutenant Joseph Underwood by Alfred Agate that I just recently found. So when they were able to reclaim the bodies and bring them back to the ship, and when Charles Wilkes heard about this, Midshipman Henry was his nephew. And so Charles Wilkes just absolutely became catatonic. He just absolutely was unable to make any decisions about what to do next. And he shut himself in his cabin. And our Alfred Agate actually was the one who sort of got involved and decided, okay, we have to bury these sailors, we have to give them a proper funeral. And so he oversaw all that. And so they found this island, Henry's Island. And that's where they buried the two sailors. And so I was obsessed with finding Henry's Island. At the time, I did not have a good chart. I did not have the USXX chart. There is no Henry's Island on any British Admiralty charts or any charts you can find today. So I was trying to figure out where this island could be. But I knew that Alfred Agate was very good at drawing landscapes. And so I saw this ridge line. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll be able to match this ridge line to his picture and figure it out that way. So I had actually airdropped this picture to various voyage crew on the Bark Europa in the hopes that somebody would make the connection. And our own Andy Washington, who is on this call, was the one that told me early one morning that he had found it. And here we have a picture of where we were when he told me that. And here you can see this little bump here, which matches this little bump here. And there's a little face here, which is actually called the sleeping giant. And it's actually, I can't really show it because of the faces here, but it's also there. So I knew I was close. We were near Henry's Island, but there's no island right here. But if you look off the other side of our ship, we saw this island, which matches this island. Today, this island is called Serenity Island. There's a resort on it. It has also been called Kadavulailai, and at some point it was also called Bounty Island for some unknown reason. But so our Alfred Agate took maybe some liberties with the landscape here, but it's still pretty accurate. I wasn't actually able to visit Serenity Island. I really, really wanted to, because I wanted to go in the middle and see if I could find anything that would possibly look like something was buried there. But some people, some of the other voyage crew did get to go there and did ask the resort workers if there was a grave site on there, and they were told, yes, there is a grave site of two American sailors. And I have since been able to track down that there is a U.S. Navy cemetery on an island off Fiji, but they weren't able to tell me what name. And I was like, oh, I know the name. I know the name. But the U.S. Navy does know that there are two American sailors buried on this island, which was sort of thrilling to me. After this, though, Charles Wilkes kind of woke back up again, and he decided he was going to attack Sualib, and he massacred a whole bunch of Fijian villagers and destroyed their two villages on the island of Malolo in retaliation for killing Underwood and Henry. He burned the village to the ground. He killed over 100 men, women, and children, shooting a lot of them in the back as they were leaving, as they were trying to escape. Not so great. This was something he was court-martialed for when he got back to the States, but he was not convicted of anything. And this was a picture that Alfred Agate did of this massacre, because apparently he did witness it. Today, this is what Malolo looks like, and this is the town of today it's called Solevu, but at that time it was called Sualib, so it's still around. The next thing is we landed, we docked in Lautoka, Fiji at this giant container ship port. It was really like we were smacked hard in the face by the 21st century when we docked here. We were next to this like 20-story high Chinese ship, and that they were just constantly filling up with, I'd never been so close actually to a container ship being loaded, but they were just loading it up for 24/7, lights on. It was just quite a way to come back to reality. The USXX, they continued sailing for another year or so, and they arrive at Brooklyn Navy Yard in June of 1842. Just want to put a little pin on the story of Vedovi. They did keep him in chains until they left Fiji, and then they let him out of his chains, but they kept him and they took him all the way back to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But he was very, very ill by the time they returned, and he died almost as soon as they docked. There is a story about that they had buried his body there at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but they had severed his head from his body and given it to a headhunter phrenologist named Dr. Samuel George Morton, who was trying to come up with a hierarchy of the races, and he did not have a head from the South Pacific. When he died, Vedovi's cranium was actually sent to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And I have heard a story which I have not been able to fact check, because nobody likes to talk about the human remains that the Smithsonian Museum still hold. But I have heard the story that they did try to return this cranium to the descendants of Vedovi. And in 2008, some of these descendants came to the Smithsonian. They brought a special bark cloth. They reverently put the cranium on the bark cloth. They said some prayers, and then they were turning to leave. And the people at the Smithsonian said, aren't you going to take your ancestor with you? And they said, no, this is a wonderful, wonderful honor that our ancestor is in your great museum, but we want to know, why don't you have him on display? I read this in a newspaper in Fiji, and I actually talked to somebody in Fiji who knew this story. But the Smithsonian is mum on this, and the U.S. State Department doesn't answer my emails, so I should probably stop telling this story. But I kind of like it, so I keep telling it. Little coda to Alfred Agate's story. He came back to Ossining. He was also very ill. He probably recuperated at his house at 2 Liberty Street that I showed you earlier. And then he managed to miss all of Charles Wilkes's courts martial. So that's probably why he was still talking to him. Alfred Agate got a job with the U.S. Bureau of Engraving in Washington, D.C., and oversaw the publication of all the illustrations in the narrative. But sadly, he had tuberculosis, and he died in 1846 at the age of 32. So that's where his career and his life end. That's pretty much all I have. Just want to give you a little just put a pin in all the things that the USXX actually encountered, or actually just managed to do. They did survey lots of Pacific islands, created lots of charts that were actually still being used by the U.S. in World War II. So perhaps that could explain why some of the Pacific theater battles maybe didn't go quite so well, because they were using such old charts. They mapped 800 miles of coastline of the Pacific Northwest, charted the 1,500 miles of the Antarctic continent. The part that they charted is still called Wilkes Land today. And as I said, many people do think that this expedition was the one that was the first to discover that Antarctica was actually a continent and just not a pile of ice. And they brought back about 40 tons of specimens of all kinds. And that became the core of the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum and the first exhibit in 1857. And I've actually been down there, and if you go to the U.S. Botanical Garden, they actually have some plants that come from plants that were collected during the U.S. exploring expedition, which was pretty thrilling to me. So that's all I've got. I will leave you with a beautiful picture looking through the rigging of a sunset in Bora Bora. But I will say that this was a pretty thrilling expedition for me, and just to follow the wake of this expedition from many years ago. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I know I've gone on a bit long, but thank you very much for this opportunity.